Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to deal with check raises, and we're going to talk about check raises versus c-bet, delay c-bet, sorry, c-bet, turn c-bet, and river c-bet. And I want to kick it off with talking about versus flop c-bet because that's the one that's going to happen the most often. It's a lot easier to get to the flop bet and get check raised than it is to have to go bet, call, and get check raised on the river. So let's start off with talking about facing flop check raises. Now, I want to open up by just talking about the math a little bit here on the flop, and then we're going to go into something a little bit. I will talk a little bit more about some other subjects. Okay, so here you have kind of a standard flop bet size and flop check raise size, and I just want to talk about the odds necessary in this spot as far as the big blind raising very low equity hands. So let's just start off by pretending the big blind has no equity and go from there. So here it's you're risking 1827 to win a pot of 1383. So we add these together, 1384 plus 1827. So you're trying to win a pot of 3211 and you're risking 827. So 3211, I'll just go with it. All right, so if you had no equity, you would need them to fold about 57% of the time in order to make this check raise profitable. So the flop check raise, it's, I'm not saying that it can't be profitable, particularly with equity like straight draws, overcards, backdoor flush draws, definitely can get quite profitable. But it's never really that attractive of a bluff opportunity because the way that people see bet, they generally have a more polarized strategy where they're going to bet fold hands like this, and they're going to bet call when they have draws and good hands, etc. So, you should never be too worried, I think, when people start having very aggressive check raises against you. You might want to tone down the bet frequency in your c-bet slightly. But again, I wouldn't get too carried away because your strategy is going to kind of naturally play well. In fact, if you just fold these backdoor draws, generally fold, and then call with your flop draws slash good hands, you're typically going to end up folding around, mine was 46 in the sample, and they're just going to have equity against you to bluff there. And it's also worth noting that 46, when they're bluffing, is more like 42 or 40 or 38, and when they have it, it's more like 50, 52, 54. So realistically, if you just play kind of straightforward, and when you get check raised, think about like, okay, is this in my top half of my hands? And continue by calling. And if it's not, then continue by folding. You're gonna be just fine. Now, I do want to say this. I want to talk about three betting the flop check raise. And I'm actually surprised as to how much I ended up doing this in the sample. I guess I do remember playing a couple opponents that played particularly weak against the flop 3-bet. I was using a small size and ended up getting a lot of folds. So I guess I can say that there are opponents where it does make sense. But it's going to sound almost hypocritical now because I 3-bet so much in the sample. But there's two reasonable ways to play facing a check raise on the flop. And you can either play it by deciding to call with all of your range, or you can decide to play it by 3-betting with a small subset of your range. But the main line that you're going to use to counter the check raise is to call. Because when they check raise, they're saying essentially that they have either a very strong hand, some kind of draw, or they're bluffing. And so by 3-betting, it doesn't really do that much for many of your value bets. Like, for example, let's say you have kings and someone check raises you on a board like 9-8-4. 3-betting doesn't really do that much for you because if they have like a gut shot type draw, they're going to fold. And then when they do continue, they're going to have hands like open-enders, which you're ahead of, but then also hands like, sets or two-pair or whatever. So, maybe 9-8-4 is a little bit interesting of an example because on a board like that, the big blind doesn't have 9-9 or 8-8. Those hands are generally 3-betting pre-flop, and additionally, the big blind probably doesn't have 9-4 off, 8-4 off. So maybe on that board specifically, it could be more reasonable to 3-bet over pairs on the flop because of how few combinations your opponent has that beat you. But in general, the point remains that 3-betting on the flop needs to be reserved for a few different types of hands. It needs to be reserved for bluffs that are not quite enough equity to call, very strong draws that play well across later streets, and then value bets that are strong enough to play across later streets as well. But here's the thing. If you're going to always 3-bet all your value bets on the flop, then you're going to run into some trouble. So let's actually pull up Equilab. Let's talk about 3-betting here. Let's break down some ranges as far as what could be a reasonable flop 3-bet strategy. And let's take the board like 9-8-4. Take a board like, or 9-8 deuce here rather, which actually does make a little bit of a difference. So let's say that we want to have a flop 3-bet strategy. Now, because our opponent's jumping a strong range, and because if our opponent jams, they're getting much better odds on that jam to win the pot, we can't bluff nearly at the same frequency that we can bluff c-bet. Because your opponent wins more by jamming, they have a much stronger range, and we're going to need to tread more lightly. So maybe a standard c-bet range has about 2 bluffs for every value bet, or 2.5 bluffs for every value bet. Now we need to have about, I would say, a closer to 1-to-1 ratio, maybe even a little bit more on the value heavy side. But we need to make sure that we are not over bluffing here. And 11% flop 3-bet is certainly too high. It doesn't even really make sense for it to be that high. They're check raising 8%. You should never be re-raising a prior raised number more often than they're raising you in general. It just doesn't really make that much sense. So let's go ahead and just take the 9-8 deuce rainbow board here. And let's just talk about some of the ways that we would structure this. And again, I will say, if you wanted to never have a flop 3-bet strategy, I don't think that would end up costing you much EV. I think it would be slightly worse. I think the main problem with not having flop 3-bets is you do incentivize your opponent to get more aggressive with what they check raise. Like, let's say that I'm playing an opponent and I know they won't 3-bet the flop. Well, then all of a sudden check raising a hand like a good 9 or some straight draws that don't mind getting 3-bet, or sorry, that would be upset if they got 3-bet, or check raising some flush draws on flush draw boards. All of those check raises become much more reasonable if you know you're going to get to secure a turn. If you're going to get 3-bet some percentage of the time, then that's a little bit more dicey of a proposition. So I would recommend introducing a small 3-bet frequency to your flop range, but primarily continuing by calling. Okay, so let's talk about the kinds of hands that we want to use. So for starters, let's kick it off with the value. And I want to say that I don't really think that we're almost ever going to 3-bet 9s here. Because first off, we've talked about this before, but 9s is generally going to check the flop back. You know, we're going to split most of our combos into check. So if we do have 9s and we bet we get check raised, the chance that our opponent is bluffing is now just sizable. I mean, unless they have deuces or 9 deuce suited or 8 deuce suited, they're bluffing. So essentially, with a hand like 9s, we're going to call and like to play some different runouts. And we're not even going to have that very often because we're primarily checking the flop. 8s, I don't really mind either way. We're always going to be c-betting this on this flop. There's a lot of top pairs to get value from. So I don't really mind maybe doing it half the time or so. I think both are okay. I really don't mind either way. So we'll just say 2 of the 3 combos here we're gonna be using for 3-bet. Deuces in general is another interesting hand here because when you have deuce, now the chance they're bluffing also goes up pretty dramatically because they don't have a set of deuces, and now the chance that they have 2 pair has gone down drastically as well. But in general, I would say the middle and bottom sets we're generally looking to fast play, but keep about 1 of the 3 combos into the call range. So we're gonna have 2/3 of our 8s, 2/3 of our deuces. 9-8 I think is a pretty mandatory 3-bet if you're gonna have a 3-bet range. I would recommend doing it mainly. So let's just say we're gonna 3-bet this with about 3/4 of these hands. We're not gonna have these, and so let's just take out. And we'll say it'll be about 6 combos, and we'll just do it here as well. Oh yes, so we'll say half of this. And again, when we're making these ranges, it's going to be a little less informative out of the gate as we're building our strategy. So all of these hands make sense. If you can have 9 deuce or 8 deuce off, you're almost never going to have those though. So let's not even talk about that. And I think 9 deuce is also a reasonable flop 3-bet. I think once you get to 8 deuce, you're trying to get a little bit too thin. In fact, even with 9 deuce, it's starting to get pretty close. on whether you're actually going to want to have this for value or not. I guess it kind of depends on your opponent, the way they're check raising. Let's go ahead and not put it in. So our value range is only going to be 10 combos. So we're only going to want to have about 10 combos for bluffs. But what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to spread them around in a bunch of different places so that we're not overly bluff heavy. Now, one of the first hands I would pick, we're going to be betting about half or a fourth of our ace deuces here on the flop. And so I would make sure to pick a couple combos of ace deuce out. Maybe that means just like a third of the time you do bet ace deuce, you're going to be 3-betting it. And this is going to be your go-to hand that's going to 3-bet the flop and run it. Because when you have ace deuce, you block 9 deuce, you block 8 deuce, you block deuce deuce. They're not going to have 9-9 or 8-8. So, and then if they do have a hand like 9-8, you can actually still improve to win on a deuce or an ace. So this is going to be your hand. You're 3-betting the flop and planning on running it. You're not going to want to run it with too many hands in this spot because your opponent's going to have a lot of good hands when you don't have 9 or 8. They're much more likely to have a hand like a 9 or an 8 in their hand. So we're going to pick ace deuce as our 3-bet and run it. As far as what straight draws we want to use, we're generally going to want to take straight draws that are like on the fringe between being able to call or fold. So what I usually like to do in these spots, I like to pick a hand like 7, 6, 6, 5. Some of these hands without the backdoor flush draws, and just take a couple combos of both these hands as well. So now we're starting to build out a few more straight draws that we can have. And then I wouldn't mind balancing this out with a couple other straight draws, like maybe 10-6. A couple combos of that. And then finally, I like to use a couple of the nut flush draws, nut backdoor flush draws that we elected to bet in the flop, which are usually these guys right here. And maybe just like, let's just say it's ace 3. And we're going to use one of each suit that has a backdoor flush draw. So that way we can still have a few in the, it doesn't really matter which. Okay, so here we have about half value, half bluff. If you wanted to, rather than doing 2 combos of all these straight draws, you could spread them out. You could do 1 combo of all of these. You could maybe throw in 1 combo of hands like Jack 10 or 10-7 or 7-6. One of the reasons I don't like doing that is if you do get 4-bet, it is a disaster. So maybe if someone check raises you and you start to see that they're not planning on jamming, facing 3-bet, you could start to work in some hands like Jack 10. But you can't really do that too often with these flop 3-bet ranges. They need to be polar between hands that can't quite call the check raise, which are these worst straight draws. This ace deuce hand that blocks a bunch of the value that you can use as a hand to run it with, and some of these backdoor nut flush draws. So on the turn, if it's a rainbow turn, you're going to be giving up ace 3, you're going to be giving up 6-5, and you're going to barrel the turn with your value, your 10-6 or 7-5. And then on the river, you're going to use ace deuce and maybe some of these straight draws if stuff gets there. Like let's just say, for example, that a 6 comes on the turn or the river. Well, now, because you have 7-5 in your range as well, you can get more aggressive. I would maybe not look to bluff ace deuce. I would look to bluff 10-6 and 6-5. Hands that block some of the straights that are out there. So you're going to want to play turns and rivers by analyzing what are the best hands still. When you get to the turn, look at it. If it's a brick, generally stick to ace deuce and you're better of the bluff straight draws you're raising. And if it's a relevant turn, look to give up the hands like ace deuce that don't have as important removal anymore, and look to barrel the hands that have equity. Yeah, okay. And then look to barrel the hands that have equity on the later streets. And this is actually going to end up being kind of similar to the way we're going to play with our check raises. The only thing that I might add is you can check raise a decent amount more than you can 3-bet because the obvious. When you face a continuation bet, you're up against a lot more hands. So we're going to look to be a little bit more bluff heavy, a little bit more aggressive on later streets in those spots. But maybe not on boards like this where you can't have too many of the value bets to begin with. So the point to take away here is be very particular with the 3-bet bluffs you're going to work into your range. Think about what your value bets are. Try to get to around 1-to-1 on the flop. And you're going to almost always have to randomize on these straight draws, or you're just going to use too many. I mean, you need to find a way to get 1 or 2 combos of a bunch of different kinds of hands along the edges, And in doing that, you can balance your strategy. If you just pick all 6-5s, you're going to be off the charts just messing the strategy up because you're going to have so many 6-5s that are always going to bet the flop, and you have 12 combos. If you used all your 6-5s, you'd bluff too much. So there's definitely a spot, and this is something that is going to be consistent in the analysis as ranges get tighter. You definitely a spot you're going to have to work in some randomization with hands like 6-5. Okay, so going back to talking about not 3-betting anymore because you're only going to have a small subset of 3-bets. The way we play it, you are still going to have 9s. You are still going to have a set of 8s, a set of deuces. So you're going to have 3 combos of all the sets, and you're still going to have a couple top 2s. So what that will do is even on brick runouts, you can have some strong hands in your range, which is important. It's important to kind of spread those good hands out across all these things that we're going to be doing here. Now, there are just a couple general pieces of advice here when you're facing a check raise. I see a lot of players that have this problem, and there's some mantra out there that I don't understand where it came from, but it's prevalent by a lot of players, generally I guess weaker players, but there's this belief that if you're going to call the flop check raise and fold to the turn bet, why even call the flop check raise? And I'm sure a lot of you are just laughing at how ridiculous that is, but clearly that is not true. In fact, I think that one mistake a lot of players make is they play way too wide facing that turn barrel. When I look at an opponent and I see a 20% fold to the turn barrel, what that's telling me is that they're not getting rid of a bunch of hands on the turn that quite frankly need to be folded. And I guess on a board like 9-8 deuce, look back at this board, we look at the kinds of hands that we're going to be calling the flop looking to fold turn. I think of hands that are like Queen 10 for the half high side to bet. Queen 10, Queen Jack, those are good ones. The 10-6 backdoor flush draw ones, the 6-5, 7-5 backdoor flush draw ones. The open enders, obviously, you're going to have to continue to call the Jack 10s, the 10-7s, the 7-6s. But all of these gut shots, unless you turn flush draws, those are all going to be folded on the turn. And so you need to really tighten the ship on the turn so that when you get to the river, you can have a reasonable fold. Now, also in the sample, I've seen a lot of, by the river, you tend to see a lot of checking. I think players are usually more conservative on the river than the turn, because on the turn you have equity. So, yes, I can understand calling the flop raise, playing and folding the turn barrel when they have their highest barrel there. Doesn't seem like a default great strategy, but you still need to pick some folds out. And remember, even though my folds here by street facing these check raises were 46, 51, 60, you have to think about it from the bluffs, not the value bets, because you want your folds to be high when they're value betting. So when they're bluffing, this is going to be more like 40. I mean, I'm kind of just estimating, but 40, 40, 45, or 40 or whatever based on the board texture. So make sure to get rid of some hands on the turn. Clean your range up on the turn. I would say, if anything, if you want to make a tighter fold somewhere, I would say fold it on the turn. However, generally speaking, when it did get to the river, let me just look at this really quick. How often did this work? Bet, call, bet. If they do get to the river after check raise, bet, turn, and check river, they did check fold 76 in the sample. So definitely a good spot to bluff. And one spot that seemed a lot worse, and I actually don't like how I played this in the sample, but if my opponent check raised and then checked me on the turn, I bet 88% of hands. And that has a very natural counter. Like, let's say you're going to play someone, and you know that if they call a check raise, they are going to bet 88% of the time on the turn. Why ever bet yourself? There's not really much value in betting yourself, because their whole range of hands that they're going to bet, that they will continue with, or that they call a flop with, those hands are all going to bet on the turn. So you could just go for the check raise quite aggressively here. And I think maybe this is a part of my game that I made more mistakes with back in the day, where when someone did check raise you and check the turn, it was almost always a signal they were giving up. And I might add that, given the way my opponents played here by folding 53, I guess I would say that these bets are almost all profitable. In fact, with no equity, they're profitable. So this can't be that bad of a strategy. But I would like to see a little more checking and look to play some rivers when I do check back the turn, rather than just betting everything on the turn. And a lot of times this is with a small size, which makes it a bit better. But again, very direct counter. You're going to bet that too much there. Time to work in some double check raises. which happened to be 14% of the time. Anyway, when they do check the river, when they go check raise, so if they check raise flop and check turn, a lot of continuing still going on here. But when they check raise flop barrel turn and check raise flop barrel turn and check river, there was just a lot of folding. That was 76% fold. So I would say that the river spot tends to be a more profitable bluff opportunity. Generally speaking, if you check raise a good hand and bet turn, you're really only checking on rivers where you can no longer value bet, or maybe you want to set the trap, but that's more rare in general than I think check raising the flop, because players understand if you check raise the flop and check the turn, that your opponent's going to play really aggressively in that spot. So going for the double check raise there does make a lot of sense. We'll talk more about the big blind spots when we're talking about the big blind. Anyway, so let's talk about turn check raises. So bet flop call, check, bet. Okay, so in the sample, my opponents folded 45, 39, 48 by street. And again, this is kind of an example of players not wanting to fold the turn as much as they should. If I actually could change this, and this is how I played in my big blind to some extent at least, I think that having a low flop fold is extremely good because players tend to not barrel the turn as much as they should, and so you get to see a lot of rivers. I think floating the turn in general is a much weaker play because you don't get very many opportunities to bluff the river if you don't have showdown value. And then also the river tends to be the most barreled street if you face flop and turn c-bets. So tightening up there on the turn tends to be good in the big blind. So I don't really like the fold by streets my opponents used here. And if we look here at the turn check raise, and I know this is weird, the 7% means they check raised all in, I called. But if we look here on the turn check raise, if I called fairly low river barrel, but you don't want to get too carried away. You want to make sure that you're working in folds here on the turn and on the river. Here I folded 57 and then 56 to the river bet. But again, when they're bluffing, these are lower numbers. Maybe I played a little bit too weak against this. Certainly possible. But you want to make sure that when you do face that turn check raise, again, they're not getting good odds. So try to fold about half your hands or a little more than half your hands. And then on the river, this river bet will be less in relation to the pot than the turn bet normally. When you look at turn check raises, they tend to be larger than, as a percentage of the pot, larger than the river bets. So make sure to try and fold about half your hands facing the turn bet and half your hands facing the river bet. I would advocate for no turn 3-bet range, because at that point your opponent is representing such a specific range of hands that they're basically saying that they have a very strong hand or they're bluffing. And even their semi-bluffs have a lot less equity, so there's a lot less need to 3-bet and try and take the pot away. So I would say just probably don't have one. You can work out a really small specific range of hands, kind of like we did with the flop, but even more small and more specific. But in general, I wouldn't really advocate for that. I would advocate for keeping all the hands in the call, and then look just to play rivers facing bet or check. If it goes bet, call, check, bet, raise in the river. Your fold in general to this river raise will end up looking the highest. This is where removal most plays its role when facing a check raise on the river. So I wouldn't sweat it too much. Just try to think about all your hands facing a certain size. How much do I have to call to not let the non-equity bluffs through? And that's important. And also, actually, one more note on the river, facing river raise, and we'll look at some examples to talk about this more. But it's worth saying as well that when you're facing a river raise, that you really want, so first you want to think about like showdown value. If you have hands that can beat some of their value bets, those are just all have to be calls. But once you get into the range of hands that are value bets that can't beat anything that they're raising, you want to look at it from purely a removal standpoint. What hands block more of their good hands, block more of their bluffs? And oftentimes on boards that are like paired with flush draws, that can mean that hands that are trips become calls or flushes aren't, if they can't be raising flushes for value. So we'll look at some examples. We'll talk about that, and we'll look at some database analysis as well. But let's start off with talking about some how to play versus flop check raise examples. And we're going to look at some, I like to try and change the board texture up as we look at some different stuff, as we look at different spots. We talked about ace and king high boards, the kind of the standard spots, the queen through 10 high boards in the the probe spots. Let's take a look at some very dynamic mid to low boards here. Some boards that are maybe like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 high. A lot of draws. A lot of different ways we have to play across different turns and rivers.